The freezing Chicago rain didn't just wash away the city's grime, it masked the scent of a brutal corporate hit. When a desperate single father dragged a bleeding billionaire into a darkened service shaft, his only instruction was a frantic whisper, "Don't talk." That silence sparked a deadly obsession. The digital clock on the cleaning cart glowed a harsh 11:45 p.m. Caleb Wyatt dragged his aching limbs across the polished marble floor of the Davenport Holdings lobby, his mop moving in slow, methodical arcs. At 26, Caleb was intimately familiar with exhaustion. Being an unbonded Omega and a single father to a 4-year-old boy meant his life was a relentless cycle of minimum-wage shifts and overwhelming anxiety. To survive in the cutthroat environment of downtown Chicago, Caleb relied on heavy doses of gray market scent blockers. The harsh chemical spray suppressed his natural comforting scent of warm amber and cedar, replacing it with the sterile, unidentifiable smell of industrial soap. It was a miserable existence, but it kept the aggressive alphas at bay and kept a roof over little Leo's head. Caleb pushed his cart toward the service elevator, aiming for sub-level 3. His shift was technically over, but the underground executive parking garage always needed a final sweep. The elevator hummed, depositing him into the cavernous concrete expanse of the garage. It was dead silent, save for the hum of the fluorescent lights. Then, the silence shattered. It started with the sharp screech of tires, followed by the sickening thud of metal striking bone. Caleb froze his grip, tightening on the handle of his mop. He ducked behind a massive concrete pillar, just as 2 black SUVs boxed in a sleek silver Aston Martin. 3 men stepped out of the SUVs. Even from 50 feet away, Caleb could smell the sour, aggressive stench of hostile alphas. They were armed. A man staggered out of the Aston Martin, clutching his side. Caleb recognized him instantly. Christian Davenport, the 32-year-old Alpha CEO of Davenport Holdings. Christian was a ghost to the lower-level staff, a titan of industry, known for his ruthless business acumen and his imposing, dominant presence. Now that presence was fracturing. The sharp, commanding scent of winter storm and crushed pine that usually followed the CEO was currently tainted with the coppery tang of injury and the bitter edge of pure adrenaline. "It's over, Christian," one of the armed men sneered, stepping forward. "Mr. Croft sends his regards. He said the transition of power requires a permanent resignation." Thomas Croft, the chief operating officer. Caleb's eyes widened. He was witnessing a corporate coup, an execution. Christian coughed, leaning heavily against the hood of his car. "Croft is a fool if he thinks he can control the board without me. He doesn't need to control them. He just needs you out of the way before the FDA audit uncovers what's really in the new suppressant line." Caleb's breath hitched. The new suppressant line, the very medication Caleb had been saving up to buy, the one marketed as a revolutionary, side-effect-free miracle for Omegas. The armed man raised his weapon. Christian braced himself, his alpha pride refusing to let him look away. Instinct overrode Caleb's paralyzing fear. He wasn't a fighter, but he knew this building better than anyone. 10 feet to Caleb's left was an unmarked steel door, a maintenance shaft that led to the city's old underground utility tunnels. It wasn't on the official blueprints. Caleb grabbed a heavy metal wrench from his cart. With a desperate heave, he hurled it across the garage. It smashed into a fire alarm pull station on the far wall. The glass shattered, and instantly the garage was plunged into a deafening symphony of klaxons and blinding strobe lights. The hitmen flinched their attention, snapping toward the noise. In that split second, Caleb sprinted from the pillar. He grabbed Christian's uninjured arm, his small, calloused hands surprisingly strong. Christian violently recoiled, his alpha instincts flaring at the sudden touch, ready to strike. "Move!" Caleb hissed, shoving his master keycard into the scanner of the steel door. He practically tackled the much larger man into the pitch-black shaft, yanking the heavy door shut, just as bullets pinged against the exterior metal. The maintenance shaft was barely wide enough for the two of them. It smelled of rust and old dust. Christian was breathing heavily, his broad chest pressing dangerously close to Caleb in the dark. The Alpha's hand flew up, pinning Caleb to the cold concrete wall by his throat. "Who the hell are you?" Christian demanded, his voice a low, lethal rumble that made Caleb's Omega instincts scream in terror. "Did Croft send you to finish the job?" Outside, the muffled shouts of the hitmen echoed through the steel door. "Find him." He couldn't have gone far. Caleb desperately pried at Christian's fingers. He reached up with his other hand and clamped it firmly over the CEO's mouth. "Don't talk," Caleb whispered, his voice trembling but fiercely absolute. "If you make a sound, they will kill us both." For a long, agonizing minute, neither man moved. Christian stared down into the darkness, his eyes slowly adjusting. He could faintly see the terrified but resolute face of his savior. More importantly, beneath the harsh chemical smell of cheap soap, Christian's heightened alpha senses caught a faint underlying trace of amber. An Omega. A terrified, incredibly brave Omega. Christian slowly lowered his hand from Caleb's throat. Caleb kept his hand over Christian's mouth until the footsteps outside finally faded into the distance. "They'll lock down the building," Caleb whispered, finally dropping his hand. "We have to go down, into the utility tunnels." "Can you walk?" "I don't have a choice," Christian grunted, clutching his bleeding side. "Lead the way." The journey through the underground tunnels was a blur of agonizing pain and suffocating darkness. By the time they emerged 2 miles away in the industrial sector of the South Loop, Christian was running on pure willpower. Caleb had half-carried the broad-shouldered CEO the last few blocks to a dilapidated apartment complex wedged between a train track and an abandoned warehouse. Caleb unlocked the door to Unit 4B and practically dragged Christian inside. The apartment was tiny, just a living room that doubled as a kitchen and a single bedroom, but it was impeccably clean. "Stay here," Caleb ordered, easing Christian onto a worn, faded yellow sofa. Christian hissed as his back hit the cushions. He looked around the dimly lit room. There were crayon drawings taped to the peeling refrigerator and a small basket of cheap plastic toys in the corner. "You have a pup," Christian observed, his voice strained. "My son is asleep in the bedroom." "Keep your voice down," Caleb said sharply, rushing into the tiny bathroom. He returned a moment later with a first aid kit that looked like it had been cobbled together from dollar store supplies. "You need a hospital," Caleb muttered, kneeling beside the sofa and pulling a pair of scissors from the kit. "No hospitals," Christian growled, his alpha authority instinctively flaring. "Croft owns the chief of police in this district. A hospital is a death sentence." "Then you're going to have to trust me," Caleb said. He carefully cut away the ruined, blood-soaked fabric of Christian's custom Brioni shirt. The wound was a deep laceration along the ribs, a bullet graze that had torn through muscle but miraculously missed the organs. Christian watched the Omega work. Caleb's hands were steady as he cleaned the wound with harsh antiseptic. The proximity was intoxicating. Stripped of his suit and his corporate armor, Christian was acutely aware of the dynamic between them. Alphas were biologically wired to protect Omegas. Yet here he was, bleeding on a cheap sofa, entirely at the mercy of a janitor. "You're an Omega," Christian said quietly, his eyes locked on Caleb's face. "But you mask your scent." "It's a requirement for the job," Caleb lied smoothly, threading a suturing needle. "Davenport Holdings has a strict neutral workplace policy. A policy meant for alphas and betas to stop posturing," Christian corrected him, wincing as the needle pierced his skin, not to force Omegas to poison themselves with chemical blockers. "Tell that to your HR department," Caleb retorted, tying off the first stitch. "Now hold still." For the next 20 minutes, the only sound in the apartment was the distant rumble of the L train and Christian's ragged breathing. When Caleb finally taped a gauze pad over the stitches, he slumped back against the coffee table, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Thank you," Christian said, the genuine gratitude in his tone sounding foreign even to his own ears. "I don't even know your name." "Caleb Wyatt." "Well, Caleb Wyatt, you just saved my life, and tomorrow I'm going to make sure you never have to mop a floor again." "Chris." Christian reached into his trousers for his phone, but the screen was shattered dead from the impact against the garage wall. "You can't go back," Caleb said, his voice grave. He pulled his own cracked, outdated smartphone from his pocket and tossed it onto Christian's lap. It was open to a local news site. Christian stared at the screen. The headline blared, "Tragedy at Davenport Holdings." CEO Christian Davenport feared dead in apparent carjacking. Croft didn't waste any time. Christian murmured, his jaw clenching. He's already controlling the narrative. He wants the board to vote him in as interim CEO by morning. "Before they were going to shoot you," Caleb started hesitantly. The man mentioned the new suppressant line. He said there was something the FDA audit would find. Christian's expression darkened. The scent of winter storm filled the small room, thick with anger and regret. Project Serenity. It was supposed to be a breakthrough, a synthetic suppressant that would completely eliminate an Omega's heat cycle without the usual lethargy. But 2 weeks ago, I found discrepancies in the clinical trial data. Croft had buried the long-term effects. Caleb's blood ran cold. What effects? "Total endocrine collapse," Christian said quietly. "Infertility, neurological degradation. It effectively hollows out the Omega's biological systems. I ordered the project shut down and was preparing to hand the files over to the authorities. Croft knew that if I did, he'd spend the rest of his life in federal prison." Caleb stared at the floor, nausea rolling through his stomach. For the past 6 months, he had been skipping meals, saving every spare dollar to afford the early access prescriptions of Project Serenity for himself. He had been desperate for a cure to the agonizing heats that threatened his ability to work and care for his son. He had almost bought his own poison. A soft creak interrupted the heavy silence. Both men turned their heads. Standing in the doorway of the bedroom was a small boy with messy brown curls clutching a worn stuffed bear. Leo rubbed his sleepy eyes, staring at the giant, bloody stranger on their sofa. "Daddy!" Leo mumbled, his little nose twitching. He looked at Christian. "You smell like the big trees at the park." Christian's hardened exterior cracked. He looked at the child, then at Caleb, who immediately stood up and crossed the room, scooping the boy into his arms. "It's okay, Leo," Caleb whispered, burying his face in his son's hair. "Mr. Davenport is just visiting for a little while." Christian watched the Omega protectively shield his pup. A deep, primal urge settled in Christian's chest, an urge that had absolutely nothing to do with corporate mergers or stock prices. Thomas Croft had made a fatal miscalculation. He had forced Christian into the shadows, but he had also inadvertently introduced him to the one thing Christian hadn't realized he was missing. "I'm not just visiting Caleb," Christian said softly, his alpha eyes locking onto the Omegas. "We have a city to take back." Morning light filtered through the cracked blinds of the tiny apartment, casting harsh shadows across the faded yellow sofa. Christian awoke to the smell of cheap burnt toast and the quiet murmur of a television. His side throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, but the bleeding had stopped. He pushed himself up his eyes, scanning the cramped room. Caleb was at the miniature kitchen counter, meticulously cutting a single piece of toast into small squares for his son. "You shouldn't be moving," Caleb said without turning around, his voice tight with lingering anxiety. "I don't have the luxury of resting." Christian grunted, swinging his legs off the sofa. He winced, his hand instinctively going to his bandaged ribs. "Croft is convening the board at noon. By 1 p.m., he'll be the interim CEO, and by 2 p.m., he'll authorize the mass production of Project Serenity. I need to get back into the Davenport servers." Caleb turned, wiping his hands on a faded dish towel. He looked exhausted, the dark circles under his eyes, a testament to a sleepless night spent standing guard over a wounded billionaire. "You said your phone was destroyed, and I don't own a computer. How do you plan on stopping a multi-billion-dollar corporate takeover from my kitchen?" Christian's gaze hardened. "I need a burner laptop and a secure Wi-Fi connection. But more importantly, I need a direct line to Jonathan Hayes. He's my chief information officer and the only executive I trust unconditionally. If Croft hasn't purged him yet, Jonathan can grant me backdoor access to the encrypted clinical trial files." Caleb hesitated. He walked over to a small battered tin canister sitting on the top shelf of his pantry. He pulled it down his fingers, lingering on the lid before he opened it. Inside was a small stack of crumpled $20 bills, his emergency fund painstakingly saved over months of skipping meals. He pulled out $200. "There's an electronics pawn shop 3 blocks down," Caleb said, his voice quiet but resolute. "They open at 8. I can get a cheap laptop. But you have to promise me, Christian. You have to promise me you'll expose that drug. If it goes to market people like me, we won't survive it." Christian looked at the crumpled bills, acutely aware of what that money meant to a man living on the edge of poverty. A protective instinct, fierce and undeniable, flared within his chest. "I swear it, Caleb, on my life." By 9:30 a.m., Christian was hunched over a battered, thick Lenovo laptop sitting on Caleb's small dining table. His fingers flew across the keyboard with a frantic, practiced urgency. Caleb watched, nervously bouncing a giggling Leo on his hip. The harsh industrial soap scent Caleb used to mask himself was beginning to fade, and a faint, sweet aroma of warm amber was slowly filling the small room. Christian's jaw tightened every time the scent hit him, his alpha biology reacting viscerally to the distressed Omega in his territory. "Damn it!" Christian hissed, slamming a fist onto the table. The cheap plastic rattled. "What's wrong?" Caleb asked, stepping closer. "Jonathan set up the back door, but Croft is paranoid." Christian growled, his eyes fixed on the flashing red access denied prompts on the screen. "Croft initiated a localized hard lock on the Project Serenity files. They can't be accessed remotely. He's going to physically wipe the drives in the sub-level 2 server farm before the board meeting." "So all the evidence is going to disappear?" Caleb asked, his heart sinking. "Unless someone is physically standing in that server room with an encrypted flash drive to download the unredacted files before Croft hits delete," Christian said, leaning back in his chair, running a hand over his face. "And there is a small army of private security between the lobby and sub-level 2 right now." Caleb stared at the screen, then down at the master keycard attached to his janitorial lanyard resting on the counter. He thought about the deadly side effects of the suppressant. He thought about thousands of desperate Omegas who would buy it thinking it was a miracle. "They disabled your biometric access," Caleb said slowly, his voice trembling slightly. "But they didn't disable mine. I'm just a ghost who mops the floors. My badge works on every maintenance door in the building. Christian looked up, his eyes widening. Caleb, absolutely not. I am not sending you back into that building. Croft's men are armed, and they shoot to kill. You can't walk 10 feet without bleeding through your shirt. Caleb countered his Omega instincts, warring with his newfound courage. And I know the ventilation shafts that connect the parking garage to the sub-level 2 cooling rooms. The security cameras in the old shafts have been dead for a decade. I can get us in. Christian stood up, ignoring the shooting pain in his side. He towered over Caleb, the scent of winter storm and crushed pine rolling off him in heavy, dominant waves. It is a suicide mission. If they catch me, I'm dead anyway. Caleb interrupted, holding his ground despite the biological urge to submit to the angry alpha. Croft's people saw my cleaning cart. They'll eventually check the security footage and see my face. They will come for me, Christian. My only way out of this is to help you tear Croft down. Silence stretched between them, heavy and charged. Christian looked at Caleb, truly seeing the incredible strength hidden beneath the worn clothes and the scent blockers. He wasn't just a survivor. He was a fighter. Okay. Christian finally relented, his voice a low gravel. We go together. You get us into the server room and I download the files. But Caleb... Christian reached out his large, warm hand, gently gripping Caleb's shoulder. You stay behind me. Always. The service tunnels beneath Davenport Holdings were a labyrinth of rusted pipes and hissing steam vents. Caleb led the way, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. Christian followed closely, his breathing labored but his focus absolute. It was 11:15 a.m. The board meeting was starting in 45 minutes. They reached the heavy steel grate that separated the old tunnels from the modern, climate-controlled sub-levels of the building. Caleb swiped his badge. A small green light flashed, and the heavy door clicked open. The server farm is 50 yards down this corridor. Caleb whispered, his heart hammering against his ribs. They slipped into the sterile, brightly lit hallway. It was eerily quiet. Croft had clearly cleared the lower levels of non-essential personnel to ensure his digital cover-up went unnoticed. They reached the reinforced glass doors of the server room. Christian plugged a small decryption device provided by a frantic Jonathan Hayes, who had met them in a nearby alley, into the door's keypad. 3 agonizing seconds later, the doors slid open. The server room was deafening, the roar of massive cooling fans masking their footsteps. Christian immediately moved to the primary terminal, his fingers flying across the glowing keyboard. He's initiating the wipe protocol in 10 minutes, Christian muttered. I'm bypassing the firewall. Give me 3 minutes to download the raw data. Caleb stood watch by the glass doors, his hands sweating. He watched the progress bar on Christian's screen. 40%, 55%, 70%. Suddenly, the elevator at the far end of the hallway dinged. Caleb's blood ran cold. 2 men in dark suits stepped out, assault rifles strapped to their chests. It was the same hitmen from the parking garage. Christian, Caleb hissed, stepping back from the glass. They're here. 90%, Christian replied, his voice deadly calm. He didn't look away from the screen. Get behind the main server racks, now. Caleb scrambled behind a massive row of blinking black towers. The security guards approached the glass doors, noticing the bypassed lock. They raised their weapons and pushed into the room. Sweep the aisles, one of the guards shouted over the roar of the fans. The progress bar hit 100%. Christian yanked the encrypted flash drive from the terminal. As he turned, a guard rounded the corner, raising his rifle. Christian didn't hesitate. Despite his injured ribs, he lunged forward with explosive alpha speed, driving his shoulder into the guard's chest. The rifle clattered to the floor as both men crashed into a server rack. Christian delivered a brutal, precise strike to the guard's jaw, knocking him unconscious instantly. The second guard rounded the corner, aiming his weapon at Christian's back. From the shadows, Caleb hurled a heavy metal fire extinguisher. It struck the second guard square in the face. The man staggered backward, dropping his gun. Christian surged forward, disarming the man, and delivering a crippling blow to his knee. Panting heavily, Christian picked up the dropped rifle and looked at Caleb. The Omega was trembling, but his eyes were fierce. "I told you to stay behind me," Christian said, though a dark, proud smile tugged at his lips. "You were taking too long." Caleb shot back, his adrenaline peaking. "Let's crash a board meeting," Christian said, gripping the flash drive tightly. 70 floors above the executive boardroom was a theater of tense whispers. Thomas Croft stood at the head of the massive mahogany table, projecting an aura of solemn grief. The tragic loss of Christian Davenport leaves a void in this company. Croft addressed the 12 board members, his voice smooth and practiced. "But we must look to the future. Project Serenity is ready for market. As your interim CEOI, move for an immediate vote to launch." "I second the motion," a sycophantic board member chimed in. "All in favor?" Croft asked, a victorious smirk touching his lips. Before a single hand could be raised, the heavy oak double doors of the boardroom violently burst open. Christian Davenport strode into the room, his clothes stained with dried blood, his face a mask of lethal fury. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the collective gasp of the board members. Croft's face drained of all color, his arrogant smirk instantly dissolving into an expression of sheer terror. "I'm afraid I have to veto that motion, Thomas." Christian's voice boomed, his alpha presence expanding to fill the room, suffocating and absolute. Behind Christian, Caleb stepped into the room, flanked by 6 heavily armed Chicago police SWAT officers. Officers Jonathan Hayes had waiting on standby, outside the building, loyal only to the true CEO. Christian slammed the encrypted flash drive onto the mahogany table. This drive contains the unredacted clinical trials for Project Serenity, proving the drug causes irreversible endocrine failure in omegas. It also contains the financial wire transfers from Thomas Croft to a private security firm authorizing my assassination. Chaos erupted. Board members shouted, scrambling away from Croft. The SWAT officers swiftly moved in, shoving a screaming, protesting Croft against the wall and clicking heavy steel handcuffs onto his wrists. "You're dead," Croft shrieked as he was dragged out the doors. "You're supposed to be dead." Christian didn't even look at him. He turned his back on the hysterical board members and walked straight toward Caleb. The adrenaline was fading, and Christian swayed slightly, his hand clutching his bleeding side. Caleb instinctively rushed forward, catching the alpha by the arms to steady him. "We did it!" Caleb breathed, staring up at the man who had just reclaimed his empire. Christian looked down at the Omega. He inhaled deeply, bypassing the fading blockers to take in the pure, comforting scent of warm amber. "No," Christian corrected him, his voice softening, meant only for Caleb. "You did it. You saved me, Caleb. And you saved thousands of others today." 1 month later, the Davenport Holdings lobby was gleaming, but Caleb Wyatt was no longer holding a mop. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, wearing a perfectly tailored suit, watching the Chicago skyline. His scent, unblocked and unapologetically sweet, filled the air. Christian stepped up behind him, wrapping his strong arms around Caleb's waist and resting his chin on the Omega's shoulder. "Jonathan tells me the new charitable foundation for Omega Healthcare is fully funded," Christian murmured, pressing a soft kiss to Caleb's neck. Caleb leaned back into the solid warmth of his alpha. "Leo is going to love his new school. He asked if his big tree was going to pick him up today. Christian smiled, turning Caleb around and capturing his lips in a deep, claiming kiss. I wouldn't miss it for the world. What an absolute roller coaster of secrets, corporate espionage, and a romance that defied all the odds. Did you love watching Caleb risk everything to save Christian, only to find his true alpha mate in the process? If you want more heart-pounding Omegaverse dramas, intense plot twists and protective alphas falling for fierce omegas, make sure to hit that like button, share this story with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more epic, real-life storytelling videos.